Story 1. Thanksgiving on the Lake. Thanksgiving at my Uncle Ben's house was always an adventure. His house was on a large lake in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by only 5 other houses. It was rustic, isolated, and perfect for family gatherings. Uncle Ben was always a country bumpkin, but that made the holiday all the more fun. The music, games, and beer flowed freely. This year, the family gathered around 3 p.m., and we started celebrating early. We played corn sacks, cards, and even basketball, although the game ended quickly after too much beer. The atmosphere was light, a kind of chaos that felt warm and familiar. As the sun set, Aunt Mel and Uncle Ben started bringing out the food, preparing dinner under the large gazebo outside. It got dark by 6 p.m., and Uncle Ben, being the man he was, insisted on having Thanksgiving dinner outside, even though it was pitch black. That's when things started to go wrong. While we were eating, my cousin suddenly pointed to the edge of the woods and said, "Dad, who's that?" We all turned around and saw a man standing motionless just beyond the tree line. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there looking at us. Uncle Ben, who had had a few beers, stood up and started walking toward him, shouting, "Can I help you?" Here the man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and ran into the woods. Uncle Ben laughed, assuming it was one of the locals, but my aunt and I weren't so sure. It was creepy. Someone was watching us eat from the shadows. But it didn't stop there. For a short time later, I saw him again, but this time he was standing by the lake, closer to the gazebo. I pointed him out, and this time my dad, my cousin, and I stood up with Uncle Ben to confront him. But as we moved toward him, we saw another man in the woods on the other side of the yard. Both men dashed into the trees before we could reach him. By then, the fun was over. We quickly cleared the table and locked the door to the house. We could see the gazebo from the living room window, and I watched as my cousins helped clean up. The night was heavy with tension. We were all tense. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the back of the house. Everyone froze. I looked out the window and saw the tall figure from before standing under the gazebo. He was looking straight at the house. Uncle Ben grabbed his shotgun and headed for the door, but I could see he was scared. His usual brave expression had faded. The figure disappeared again before Uncle Ben could confront him. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. We stayed in the house waiting for something else to happen, but the men never returned. When the police came the next morning, they told us they had found new footprints near the house. We never learned who the men were or why they had followed us that night. But every year since, I have felt uneasy about returning to Uncle Ben's house. I will never forget the feeling of being watched in the dark, knowing they were out there, waiting. Story 2. Thanksgiving Invasion. It was a rainy Thanksgiving, the kind that gives a cozy, intimate feel to family gatherings. My family is small, so it was just my mom, my 2 sisters, and my grandparents at my mom's house for dinner. My sister Nancy had moved away years ago, but Jamie, my sister, and I still lived at home. Our grandparents lived only 20 minutes away, and they arrived at 5:00, just an hour before we were supposed to sit down to dinner. We had to help them through the rain to avoid any accidents on the slippery front porch. The storm outside made the house feel warmer, almost cozy. We set the table at 6:00 as usual, with more food than we could eat. The smells of turkey lamb and cornbread filled the air as we sat down to eat, chatting and laughing between. Rain fell steadily on the roof, making the night seem more peaceful than usual. After dinner, we moved to the living room to watch the soccer game. Before the game ended, The doorbell rang. It was still pouring rain outside, and none of us were expecting anyone. My mother, ever the practical one, said, "Oh no, what if it's your dad?" Wait, my parents didn't talk, but the idea that he might show up unannounced wasn't out of the question. She told me to check to see who it was. I went to the door and yelled, "Who is it?" But the rain drowned out the voices on the other side. When I opened the door, leaving the storm door locked, I saw a man. He was tall, wearing a large raincoat with a hood, and his face was mostly hidden in shadow. He was shouting something, but I could barely hear him over the storm. I had to ask him to repeat it twice before I understood. He said he was hungry and asked for food, saying, "God will bless you." I told him to wait and went to ask my mother what to do. My grandmother, who is always generous, immediately said, "Give him some food." But my mother was more cautious. However, I still made a plate of leftovers and went back to the door. But as soon as I handed him the plate, something changed. He tried to open the door. I shouted, "Wait, the door is locked." My heart was pounding. Why was he trying to get in? My instincts were signaling danger, but I still unlocked the door to give him the food. As soon as I started to push the door open, he yanked it open and tried to push it. Panic surged through me as I pushed him back, throwing the plate of food away. "Help!" I screamed. Nancy ran, and together we pushed the door shut as I saw two more men rushing up the front driveway. We slammed the door shut and locked it. My mother called the police as I ran to check the back door. My heart was pounding in my chest. I was the only able-bodied man in the house, and I felt I had to protect everyone. Through the window, I saw the two men run around to the backyard. They pulled on the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I watched them turn and disappear into the rain. When the police arrived, there was still food strewn on the porch, but the men were long gone. We sat in silence, processing what had just happened. Our peaceful Thanksgiving had almost turned into a nightmare. The realization was painful. Trying to do the right thing, the kind thing, had almost put us in grave danger. Then we installed a doorbell camera, but the nagging insecurity was something no security system could erase. Story 3. The Return of the Stalker. Thanksgiving has always been a comforting time for me. A day to relax, catch up with family, and take a break from the daily stresses of life. This year, my parents were hosting, so I headed over to their house, looking forward to catching up with cousins and uncles I hadn't seen in almost a year. Everything was going smoothly, as usual, until I received a long text message from an unknown number. The message began, "Hey Melissa, hope your Thanksgiving is going well." Instantly, my stomach dropped. It was Kevin, the stalker, who had been haunting my life for months. We'd matched on a dating app, but had never met in person. At first, he seemed nice enough, but after I politely declined to hang out with him, his behavior changed. He became obsessive, constantly texting me, and even threatened me once when he saw a Snapchat of me at a bar with a friend. That's when I blocked him on everything: Snapchat, Instagram, his phone number, but somehow he still found a way to contact. The messages were disturbingly long, filled with personal details he shouldn't have known. He was manipulating me, threatening me in vague ways, and the more I read, the more disgusted I felt. I texted back, "If you continue to contact me, I'm going to call the police." After sending it, I felt a momentary sense of relief, like this would finally stop him. I put my phone away, trying to focus on Thanksgiving, but half an hour later, another message came in from a different number. This was worse. It was longer and full of insults, accusing me of seducing him, calling me names, and generally acting like a narcissist. I showed the messages to my family, and they were as horrified as I was. My mother insisted that I report it to the police the next day, and I agreed. That night, I went back to my apartment where I shared with my friend Chelsea. She wasn't home yet, so I sat in my room watching a Christmas movie. I was halfway through the movie when I heard footsteps outside my door. At first, I thought it was Chelsea, but the way the footsteps moved made me uneasy. They went straight to my bedroom door, and I heard someone trying to turn the doorknob. My heart stopped. "Chelsea?" I called, but there was no answer. The doorknob rattled again, and then I heard soft footsteps retreating down the hall. I picked up my phone and saw a few new messages, one of which read, "Good thing you told me where you live." My blood ran cold. I immediately tried calling Chelsea, but she didn't answer. I called my parents, whispering into the phone that I thought Kevin had broken into my apartment. My dad said he'd be there in 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes felt like a lifetime. I stayed on the phone with him, hiding in my room until Chelsea called me back. She told me she wasn't coming home that night. Or it wasn't her. I wasn't imagining it. Kevin had come into my house. When my dad arrived, I let him in, still shaking. We searched the entire apartment, and when we got to the kitchen, he opened the sliding window. "That's your answer?" he said, disappointed. I'd forgotten to lock the door. That's how Kevin got in. The next day, I went to court and filed for a restraining order. I saw Kevin for the first time in court, his face full of smugness. Although I could never prove he had broken into my apartment, the messages were enough for the judge to grant the order. Even now, I worry that he will find another way to contact me, or worse.